this development? Okay, will do, will do. Okay, my first question would be of a general nature about what's happening with the agrarian world, and then the other issues. Ladies and gentlemen, this is 105th day of the Russian intervention and the 9th year of the war. I am Andrei Shevchenko, and on behalf of Media Center and Ukrinform, I would like to welcome all the journalists who are telling the story of our fight for freedom. Now we'll talk with Denis Marchuk, Deputy Chairman of the Ukrainian Agrarian Council. This is a public union NGO. Denis, what's your gut feeling how this year is going on for agrarians? Hello, Andrei, and hello, the studio. This year, like for all of us Ukrainians, it's all about the war, and the agrarians are not the exception to the rule, but each one in our place recognize that we need to be doing what we can because the armed forces of Ukraine, despite what's happening, they're fighting, they're counteracting, they're making everything possible for the enemy to retreat, while our job is to ensure the country with foodstuff. And we managed to do it during the spring sowing season. There were worse forecasts. We thought that we'll be able yield 60% from previous year's arable lands, but we reached the 70% milestone, which is much better for us. Thus, we'll be able to ensure not only to meet our own food needs, but also export grain and oil crops, and thus generating such needed hard currency inflows for our budget. If there are any questions in the audience, just raise your hand. But while we're doing this, let's talk about the sowing season and then the harvest. So in terms of the sowing season, whether the war has forced the agrarians to change their plans, whether we have to sow something that we haven't planned before. Well, partially the priorities have been changed, mostly because of the crop turnover, when we have no chance to sell and we had to sow anyway, and we need to think where to store the new harvest. Some of the agrarians favored not the crops that could generate lots of crop per hectare, like corn, but changing it with soya, where the storage costs are much smaller than that for corn, maize. Also, partially, we have changed the approach. Previously, we were sowing vegetables, but recognizing that the southern occupied regions in Kherson and Zaporizhia were the suppliers number one of early vegetables and seasonal vegetables. So we had to recognize where we could substitute them. So central and western regions are substituting those temporarily occupied capacities. So hopefully we'll have a good yield again, despite the presence at the losing because of the southern regions being occupied, but hopefully the armed forces of Ukraine soon enough will be able to liberate those occupied territories. So let's move on. You said about 75% of the planned volumes you managed to sow. of area, right? 75%, yes. What is needed to harvest this yield? Well, we'll start harvesting later on in a couple of months' time for winter crops, but for that we need funds, and of course, like we have the problem with the fuel and lubricants, that's what we need to provide the farmers with. The spring campaign, we used previous reserves and stockpiles, but now we are facing certain difficulties that we are running out of those reserves. So priority 1A for the cabinet ministers and us as the Agrarians Council to provide them with fuel and lubricants. Well, how dire is the situation? What consequences it might have? Well, like I said, we recognize that this is the problem when we started resolving it gradually. For instance, at the checkpoints at the border, finally they allow the oil tankers to come without waiting in line. So in a couple of weeks we won't have such a substantial deficit, but that's exactly why we are working on it. Another topic that late last week we put a shock to the whole business, not only agriculture, namely the financial interest rates of the banks increased to 25%. Well, and it's tough in the time of war to find business whose profitability is around 30%, thus allowing them to repay the interest rate. Hopefully there will be some compromise found so that this credit rate would be reduced, so people might have access to credits, because the banks could reconsider the terms for the credits that have been signed previously. But when the export is not working, when there are no live money coming in, well, paying for the interest rates at a higher rate than previously signed, well, that would make the life so much more difficult for people. Well, I would like still to ask you about some future exports challenges. It will be a substantial challenge to be able to sell abroad the harvest that will yield this year. But today, what are the possibilities to compensate the ways for exporting the harvest? Well, we're not talking here about the compensation of costs. Instead, we are discussing the opportunity of using land and river corridors and our export potentials, and the figures are speaking for themselves. In March, we exported 200,000 of grains. In April, 1.47 million tons. So if we move in the right direction with involvement of line ministries, the Agrarian and the Ministry of Agriculture and Ukrainian Railway, then we can increase it up to 50% from the exports that we had before. And previously we sold about 5 million tons. So for us right now is a priority task, and our services deliver effectively, but our Western partners fail because they don't have the well-oiled logistics to handle such a huge flow. So hopefully when we when we harvest our winter crops, hopefully our partners at the Western borders will finally hear our president, who in his pleas to each country of the world asked them to become the third party to help us open export corridors through Black Sea ports and guarantee that there will be no famine in the world by allowing the Ukrainian crops to find their consumers in Africa and Middle East in particular. So if we resolve that, we won't have to discuss any compensations. But Additionally, in the context of your question, I would like to tell you that if we are able to expedite all this, we need to know how to store those stocks, not only silos. And we reached the understanding with the Ministry of Agrarian ministry that such programs need to be funded separately, thus allowing the agrarians to purchase new technologies for storage of grain. We can collect as much harvest as we can, but it would be lost if we are not able to store them. Well, previously most of those capacities were located in the east, so we need to change the geography of the logistics and the technologies as well, right? Among other things, exactly. We can hear now lots that Russia tries to arrange the shipping of the looted Ukrainian grain from the southern regions first to the occupied Crimean Peninsula and then to Russia. Yeah, that's the truth. That's the fact that I have heard from the members of our Agrarian Council who come from Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. We learned about such facts from April. Right now, about 600,000 tons have been stolen from the agrarian companies and first delivered to the temporarily occupied territory of Crimea. Then the logistic brings it to the ports of Sevastopol in particular, and from there they go to Middle East. And there are well-known facts from the states who say that about 100,000 have been offloaded in the ports of Syria. Well-known facts now, and we have even opened the criminal cases by the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine for such crimes. The military intelligence people also help us to collect the evidence, and after we document all those cases, we will demand through the international courts of law that Russia would compensate those who suffered from those actions, not only what's being looted, but hundreds of destroyed farms and companies where the active fighting is still going on. So what do the farmers tell you exactly? Do the occupiers pay somehow for this, for the crops, or they just steal it? So is it well organized by the Russian occupational forces? Yeah, this is a well-planned operation by the occupiers. Two goals. First, provide enough food to those federal regions that are not agrarian regions, where people live poorly with not enough foodstuff. Well, look at the Krasnoyarsk region, people who say that we want to take Kherson grain for our own needs. The second priority is of a financial nature, because we're talking about dozens of millions of dollars which could be used to fund the Russian war machine. So these two factors complement each other, and they feel impunity here because, yeah, those territories are occupied. And how is it happening in reality? A couple of ways, actually. You need to sell it for nothing. If you refuse to, then they physically take the grain, the crops away from you. And through the decisions of such puppet managers who are being installed in the occupied territories, claiming that we nationalize all those assets for the interests of the community, but then being shipped out of the country altogether. Thank you, Denis Marchuk, Deputy Head of the All-Ukrainian Agrarian Council. Thank you for this conversation. Our next briefing starts at 3 sharp. We wait for Alexander Matuzyanek, the spokesperson of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. Stand